Good evening, everyone. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and welcome to the Kennedy School. We have a real treat for us tonight, someone who certainly has seen the financial crisis from all sides and was at the heart of the storm at the height of the storm. And so I'll let David introduce him briefly, but David Gergen, as you know, is leading a number of these conversations lately, and we're very, very grateful for him. David truly needs no introduction. His role here at the Harvard Kennedy School is he is the director of the Center for Public Leadership and a professor of practice, but someone who is as acute an observer of the political and intellectual scene around the country and around the world as anyone. So without further ado, let's all welcome both David and Secretary Paulson.
Thank you, David Elwood, and thanks Bill Purcell once again for his leadership of the Institute of Politics, which is co-sponsoring this, I think, with the Center for Public Leadership. We have a special treat in store tonight because Secretary Paulson is someone who has been at the epicenter of one of the most important events of our lifetimes, one that has a long ripple effect in America and across the world. And we have a chance tonight to engage in conversation with him about his reflections on what he saw in Washington, what he learned in Washington, and what the country might learn as we go forward. A word of background, Secretary Paulson was born, Hank Paulson was born in Barrington, just outside Chicago, grew up there, was recruited by Dartmouth to come and play football. Where he was a star offensive lineman. They won the Lambert Trophy. He won the Best Lineman of the Year award for New England, and he was known as the Hammer. And a nickname which probably has stuck. We would have to ask, and I should introduce her now because it was, I think, in the senior year at Dartmouth that he met Wendy. Who became his wife, Wendy. Let's see where Wendy. Wendy, please, if you should meet Wendy. I've always wondered what conversations in our household must have been like during the Bush years, because Wendy was a strong Democrat, is a strong Democrat, and it must have been some striking conversations. But even so, after completing his time at Dartmouth, Hank went on to the business school here, and upon graduation went to Washington and had an early exposure to Washington at a very high level. He was at the Defense Department first and working for David Packard, which in itself, he chose wonderful mentors along the way, and from there, not in every case, because then he went to the White House where his path and my path crossed in the early 70s in the Nixon White House. And both of us, I don't think had ever met anybody who'd gone to jail before, but we had that opportunity in those days. But he was a star, I must tell you, and one of the reasons he went back into public service, he just told me, was that he had a chance to work with George Shultz, who was then Treasury Secretary. Ken Dam, who was familiar to many of you here, was a Deputy Secretary. It's a wonderful group of people then at the Treasury Department. But after his government service in 1974, he went to Goldman Sachs, back into the Chicago area with Wendy. They were married by then. They have 2 children, and he began his career at Goldman Sachs, and within a quarter of a century had risen to the top of one of the most successful investment firms in the world. And he made it even more so in 1999 as he became the sole chair and CEO. Goldman Sachs went public. Hank was at the helm of Goldman Sachs for the next 7 years when it was spectacularly successful. And as you know, Goldman Sachs has had a long record of people, John Whitehead among them, Bob Rubin, John Corzine, of people who have entered public service. And today Goldman is under some attack, but there was a long period of time in which Goldman was very much associated with people who sort of went from the private sector into the public sector. And it was in that tradition that Hank Paulson accepted George W. Bush's offer, the recruiting. It was an intense recruiting because he turned it down once, to become Treasury Secretary in 2006. I think he must have had an inkling. It's interesting. He's written a book about his experiences. It's just come out. It's been on the bestseller list, number 3 on the bestseller list. On the Brink by Henry M. Paulson Jr. And it's interesting. He says, that he was preparing for crisis shortly after he got there, and crisis indeed hit a year later. And he was the first responder, in effect, as Treasury Secretary, along with the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner, who was then running the Fed in New York. And they were catching dominoes or putting out fires, if you'd like, with a whole series of things, whether it was Bear Stearns or Fannie and Freddie or Merrill or the question of Lehman Brothers and AIG, and then going on to the TARP funding and the bailouts. There was a whole series of episodes to prevent the collapse of the American economic system and indeed the collapse of the world economic system. He left there at the end of the Bush administration, now teaches or is a scholar in residence at Sachs, Johns Hopkins, and also has done a great deal of work on conservation and is intending to spend a fair portion of his time with Wendy, who is a strong conservationist in that area. So, with that introduction, thank you very much, sir, for coming here. We're privileged that you're with us. And we will move to questions in a short while. But I wanted to pretend that if you were teaching a short course here at Harvard, you've got in front of you some of the brightest students of the next generation. And if you had to sort of draw the lessons from what you've been through in the public sector in maybe 3 phases. The lead up to the crisis, what are the lessons there about what might have been done to prevent it and what we allowed to go on and what we should have known, then the crisis itself, and now the aftermath and what we're still grappling with. But I'd like to start, if we might, with those early days as you came into Treasury, what you faced and what you learned before everything hit the fan.
David, first of all, thank you very much, and I've long been an admirer of yours, and thank you for doing this, and welcome to all of you. Now, the early days at Treasury. Now, first of all, as I look back at the root causes of the crisis, there's a lot of blame to go around, and these excesses have been building up for a long time, and so there's. And I know a number of you in the audience have studied the economic imbalances resulting from the fact, or being driven by the fact that we as a nation save too much and borrow too much, too dependent on foreign borrowings. I know a number of you have studied housing policies, and you look at the weight of all of our housing policies between Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the FHA and the mortgage interest rate deduction, and you look at the sum total of all of them. We've stimulated housing too much. We had regulators, investors, banks, investment banks, so there's a lot that went into the making of this crisis. I would say for me, when the early days of Treasury, as I look back, the first year, I knew that we were overdue for a financial crisis. That was the first thing I talked to the president about, the first substantive issue. And when he said to me, Hank, what might cause it? I said, Mr. President, I don't know, but I guarantee you after the fact it'll be painfully obvious. But beforehand, it's always difficult to determine. I would never have guessed, for instance, that Russia would default in 98 or so on. But the thing that I was very fortunate about was that I had time to build relationships. Build a relationship with the president, because I had an understanding that I would be the primary advisor on all economic issues, domestic and international. But if I didn't build that relationship, that agreement would mean nothing. And it would be my fault if I didn't have a relationship with the president. So I had the opportunity to do that and let him understand I could be very candid behind closed doors and no public daylight, build relationships. I had an agreement when I came down that I wouldn't engage in political activity, wouldn't participate in the elections. I would, midterm elections, so I had a chance to get to know and build relationships with Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, as well as the Republicans. And so I had the opportunity to do those things, to get to know Ben Bernanke well and Tim Geithner, and because in many ways it's a story about how we work together. So I would say the early days, I knew excesses had been building up for a long time. I knew that the complexity of the financial products was going to be an issue, but we were focused on some of the wrong things. We were worried about hedge funds, and we were worried about private equity, and we didn't, the sieves and the conduits and the off-balance sheet vehicles the banks had, we weren't focused on that. The regulators weren't as aware of it. I wasn't as aware of it. So again, early on, I'm a believer that to understand this crisis, you need to understand that this was the US, it was Europe, and there were these huge cross-border capital flows that were leading to excesses, and that there were a lot of policies that were leading to excesses, and that we had a regulatory system that was broken, fragmented, without the authorities you'd like to see.
It's interesting, though, that when you write in your book that when you actually began preparing to meet a crisis, you convened a group and you began going through sort of almost pre-crisis exercises, even table exercises and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we had there's a group called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, which is chaired by the Treasury Secretary, and we added to that group, but we had the key regulators, and we met regularly to prepare and to do everything we could think of. We did go through tabletop, we sort of the financial war games. We even did one exercise that didn't end up in my book, which was with the British government. And so we did a lot of, as much work as we could think of, and I wasn't predicting a meltdown of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, but we started focusing on that right away and working to try to get the regulatory authorities and to fix part of the problem there. But it was, again, one of the other lessons that I take from my time in Washington is that it's very difficult to get Congress to act on anything that's big and complex and controversial if there's not an immediate crisis. It just is. Now, I'm very grateful that they acted in the case of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and with the TARP before the system collapsed, but it's not
But
easy.
that was one where the crisis already hit.
It was a crisis hit, but David, it's an interesting thing because I knew the crisis had hit, and a lot of people knew it had hit, but when the financial markets froze, and when short-term funding wasn't available under normal circumstances for blue chip industrial companies, I knew and believed, as did Ben and Tim, that as sure as we were sitting there, that this would be felt in the economy 4, 6, 8 weeks later. But members of Congress hadn't seen that in their districts yet, so it wasn't apparent to people. And I knew that if the system collapsed, it would be much, much, much worse. And we talked, but we got Congress to act, and Congress did act before the system collapsed.
Right.
And in an election year, that takes some doing by Congress.
Yeah. Let me come back just to go a little deeper on the question of pre-crisis and trying to get things done. David Elwood, our dean, has mobilized members of the faculty on a project called Acting in Time.
Yeah.
And because this is this is a more pervasive question, whether it's a question of our deficits or climate change or other things. What did you learn, and what can we take away from what the best way is to get action in Washington before things build up to the point that they did?
David, I don't know. You are. I mean, I'm just being honest. I'm not. The book. If you read my book, I thought I wrote it because I think there are lessons we need to learn, and I want any future people sitting in my seat or others to know what we encountered, when we encountered it, why we did what we did, how we did it. Now, as to how to get, and the book is in many ways two themes: the collision of markets and politics, or the speed with which things were hitting us. Now, in terms of because we had an impending crisis, and it took, I mean, the House voted no the first time, okay? So it took, right in the middle of the crisis, it was difficult to get the House to ask. So you take something like an area that I studied a lot when I was in Washington, which was what I believe is far and away the biggest economic challenge we face, which is the fiscal deficit. And there, the biggest part of that is the structural deficit that's embedded in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It's huge. And I have no doubt we as a country will ultimately deal with that or solve it. But the earlier we deal with it, the more flexibility we'll have, and the less of a penalty the younger generation will have to pay. Because what we're doing is the older generations are essentially stealing from the younger generations and doing something that no family would want to do. But how do you get Congress to figure out how to deal with that? So there was the idea, which I supported, was the Judge Greg Conrad Commission, which is a way of sort of admitting that it's difficult for Congress to act, but that still was ultimately going to take a vote by Congress. So that's one potential solution, but that didn't pass. Now the president's attempting to do it with executive order, but I don't know what processes we need to design. I do know, and it pains me to say this because the good news is I've traveled all around the world, spent time in every major economy. And there's no major economy in the world, including China, that doesn't have more difficult economic issues to deal with than we do. We're the strongest, richest economy in the world. But we need to deal with our issues. And so the answer to your question is the $64,000 question, and you'll have to get someone else who understands politics better than I do to help you answer it.
But let me ask you, from the outside, when you were at Goldman Sachs, did you think the government was, how did your perspective change going from a Goldman Sachs chair to sitting at the Treasury chair?
Well, obviously, you could not have sat in the chair I sat in at Treasury during a crisis. And that informed the way I thought. And so it was clearly, the lessons I learned at Treasury obviously, caused me to change some of the ways, some of the things that I believed when I was running Goldman Sachs during benign times. On the one hand, on the other hand, many people want to talk about, this was a guy who believed only in free, unfettered capital markets, and you learned regulation was necessary. But that doesn't fit the facts. I was I think one of the few CEOs that supported Sarbanes-Oxley, that spoke out at the time of the business scandals. I've always believed.
You spoke out during the Enron period.
Yeah, and I've always believed markets need to be regulated, and that the history of capital markets in the U.S. and around the world is the laws and the regulatory powers and this need to catch up with and stay ahead of the markets, and they never do. And that's why I'm so obsessed with getting regulatory reform and getting a system and a structure in place that doesn't have to be updated and changed and can fit the markets however they develop. So that was, and I always believed when I ran Goldman Sachs that liquidity was the most important thing, because when financial institutions die, they die quickly. And one of the lessons that I think was impressed upon many policymakers in the credit crisis was, as important as capital was, that liquidity management was even more important. And institutions that had heavy reliance on short-term funding needed to keep plenty of cash on hands to deal with them, to protect them when there is a crisis. One of the things I didn't know as much about when I was in the private sector was I did not fully understand how outmoded and outdated the regulatory system was, and what a patchwork quilt we had. And when it came to, and the crisis exposed huge lapses in consumer protection, investor protection. So many mortgages were really originated at the state level without adequate regulation. The fact that institutions could almost choose their regulator, and the kind of regulatory arbitrage that went on, and the gaps in the regulatory system I didn't understand.
Yeah. The banks, including investment banks, are now being painted as villains for their behavior prior to the crisis. How have your views evolved on that subject?
Well, I believe that there's plenty of blame to go around, and as I said earlier, you start with government policymakers that created these institutions called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There's a whole series of regulatory failures both in structure and regulators not doing what they need to do. The banks, certainly. I mean, some of the things I found and saw and witnessed made my blood run cold. So the banks, investors, so again, when I talk about the need to fix the regulatory system, I never would be one that would say that's going to be the only answer, because unless you ascribe to the theory that these bankers wanted to blow themselves up, you've got to believe that these problems are difficult to find, and even the best regulators have a hard time finding them. And so you need a system where there's market discipline, and investors and managers and lenders need to know that there's a consequence for their decision, and if there are losses, they need to bear it. So we need a system where no institution will be too big to fail, and if they fail, they can be liquidated, and liquidated outside of the bankruptcy process in a way in which they don't take down the system and the taxpayers don't have to come in and save them in their present form.
Alan Greenspan made this remarkable statement that has been sort of seen as an epiphany, that he had an assumption about the way markets worked, that they were self-correcting, and they would self-correct, and he discovered that that was not the case. How did you respond to that?
Well, I never believed that markets, having spent 32 years in markets, and not just in the US, but watched raw, unregulated markets in Russia and markets in China and other places work, I believe that ultimately markets are rational, but that's over a long period of time. So that is, again, why I believe that we will always have financial institutions fail. We have had from the beginning of time, there have always been bubbles. There's always been excesses. You go back to the very earliest days, whether it's China or really anywhere in the world. And usually there would be a crisis and they, in the old days, they'd kill the bankers. And so that you're going to have the problem. So I think the trick is to design a regulatory system where you have access, where you've got at least one systemic risk regulator that has got access to all the information and the ability to intervene with any type of institution to restrain or eliminate any business practice that would threaten the system. And you then have a resolution authority, a way so that systems can fail, because institutions can fail, not systems. You want to avoid the system from failing. You want to have a way to let institutions fail without taking down the rest of the system.
And you wrote in your book, you thought that disruptions, financial disruptions, where it came every few years, that you could expect them. It's one of the reasons you thought the buildups were likely to lead to some kind of disruption.
You just look at the history of our country, the modern history. Every 6, 8, 10 years, we've had disruptions or turbulence. That's why, David, I just think it is so important, and I want to be optimistic because I think the administration has made a lot of good proposals that people like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd and Richard Shelby and others are working hard on reform, and we need to get some, because if we don't get the right authorities and we don't get some of the reforms we need, the system is now so global and so complex, and institutions are so large, and there's so much concentration. The next time we have one of these crises, we could have the system collapse. And right now, the system is stable, recovery is underway, but we need to get some reform.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move on to when the crisis hit itself, and during that period, that turbulent period, really, it was a year and a half, almost 2 years. What did you take away from that? What lessons would you have for the next generation? You learned about the managing a crisis, trying to prevent it from going over a cliff.
Well, of course, anyone who's run a business or run an organization or a policymaker knows that you never have perfect information. When you've got perfect information, you're looking in the rearview mirror and it's too late. So people that say, I need all the information, I need perfect information, are going to run their company or the government or something right into a cliff. So I think I already knew that. But I think one of the things that came through to me going through the problem, and then again I got to relive it. Writing the book, I started waking up again at 2 in the morning and reliving it, and my stomach tightened up just thinking about it, because the speed at which things came at us and the decisions that had to be made, sometimes multiple decisions in a day or two or an hour, where you would like to have taken months. But we, in a number of instances, we were forced to make decisions very quickly, and decisions that we knew in some instances would have some unattractive consequences. But they'd be better than having the system collapse and having 25% unemployment and trillions more in wealth destruction. And so one of the, I recall a couple situations very vividly. One was the week when when the markets froze and we had $3.8 trillion of money market funds getting ready to implode. And many Americans didn't know the difference between a money market fund and an insured bank deposit. And they just thought that, that they would always have liquidity and their principal would be protected. And when we needed to move very quickly, and came up with the idea of using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which had never been used for something like this to guarantee the money market funds. I had some people say to me, what about the unintended consequences? And I said, well, I'm sure there'll be some, but I know what the consequences will be if we didn't do it. And then I tell the story, because I think it's important when you write a book to write it from the standpoint what you knew then, not what you know now. And so we announced this, and then the next morning Sheila Bair called and said, Hank, she's the chairman of the FDIC, why hadn't you talked about this with me? And I said, Sheila, we came up with this at the last minute, and we need to do this to prevent a meltdown. And she said, yes, but now all the money will move from the banks to the money market funds and we'll have a meltdown. I said, good point. So we corrected and we said we guaranteed all the money that was in the money market funds as of September 19th. So that's how fast we were moving. We then had the situation a number of weeks later. We were up getting the TARP, and while we were getting Congress to act on the TARP, we had Washington Mutual fail, Wachovia fail, and now institutions were going down across Europe, and 6 European nations stepped in to rescue their financial institutions. And so now we had a situation where we had the TARP on October 3rd, but the markets weren't stable. They were just on the brink of going down, and our intent to buy illiquid assets wasn't going to work because it would take too long and wouldn't be powerful enough. We needed something much more dramatic. And so now the weekend where I had the G7, so we're trying to coordinate policy on a global basis. We had the G20 finance ministers together, and I was meeting with the president and with the finance ministers. We also knew we had to do something this weekend. So as I had this big group at Treasury, and I was just pounding, because one of the things I did learn that came in, everybody's got strengths and weaknesses, and I've got plenty of weaknesses, but one of my strengths is I can be decisive and make decisions quickly, and prepared to be accountable and so on. So as I was pressing toward doing some things that last thing in the world, the second last thing in the world I wanted to do. The last thing was be Treasury Secretary while we went into a Great Depression. But so pressing people to guarantee bank liabilities and to put in capital in the banks very quickly, I had a number of people that were very close to me take me aside and said, Hank, you're just riding roughshod over everyone, and you're not letting people debate. And I said, trust me, there'll be debate, but if I don't press some of these alternatives so that they get fully developed, we won't have anything to debate and the system will collapse. So we moved very quickly, developed the capital program, the FDIC guarantee program, and then we got together for 2 hours and had policy people play devil's advocate. But that's another lesson. You need to move sometimes in a crisis faster than you'd like to move.
And with incomplete information.
With incomplete information, and it's not just incomplete, because always you've got incomplete information, but without as much time to test all of your hypotheses. Because once you put the government in the markets, it's hard to get it out. And so to me, one of the really tricky things, right now, the government is exiting, all the money's going to come back from the bank's capital program with a profit. I think if you look at the sum total of all the money we put in, people are going to be surprised at how much comes back over a 5-year period. But the question is, how do you get the government out? And I can't think of anybody better to figure this out than Ben Bernanke. How do you do it? Because everybody says we need to get the government out as soon as possible, right? But no one wants to stall the recovery. And so the question is, right now, the government owns, essentially housing finance in the U.S. That can't be right. So Fannie and Freddie, right now we need the mortgage funding, but how those institutions are restructured and scaled back and what housing policy is, or there's just a whole lot of decisions that need to be made right now in terms of how do we get the government out, but it needs to be paced properly.
During the crisis, I've been told that we actually came on a couple of occasions to within hours of going over the side, going over the brink. Is that true?
How do you know? I believe we were sure closer than I wanted to be. I think if the money markets had gone down there, it would have just, all short-term funding for companies. There was a time, David, when the week we went for TARP, after Lehman had failed, Merrill Lynch had essentially gone down because it had been acquired, so it had to be acquired. AIG had been rescued, bailed out, and the money market funds were just on the edge. That blue chip industrial companies were having trouble with their short-term funding. And they fund in the commercial paper market, and they couldn't go out for more than a day rolling it over. Now, if that had collapsed, we were on the brink. If it had gone down, I know enough to know that every CFO, they already were starting the conversations with their chief executive officers saying, boss, I don't know whether we can fund ourselves for the next 30 days. And so that means you cut back inventories, you don't pay suppliers, ultimately you can't pay your people, that ripples through the economy. Now I knew then and there that before we went to Congress, and so did Ben and so did Tim, that if we looked out a number of weeks, the economy was going to stall, unemployment was going to go up, et cetera. But you couldn't see that yet, in the economy. And so members of Congress that voted for this were making a courageous vote because we hadn't seen it. We knew it was going to happen. But if the system had collapsed and you couldn't pay your people and that rippled through the economy, you easily would have had unemployment of 25%, the wealth that would have been lost, housing prices. And just look, when you had one institution, Lehman Brothers, going down, and all the interventions, what the economic situation is in this country. And given the degree of concentration in the financial system, if you'd had another major institution go down, I think it would have brought down the rest. And then it's very hard to then repair the system and put it back together again.
So in the end, was there luck? Did you have just really talented people? Did the institutions work?
Well,
what kept us from going over the brink?
We had, David, as I say in the author's note in the book, I think the book is to a large extent, I wrote it from my perspective, my thought process, people who worked with me at Treasury. But it was a story of a handful of people. And I talked about Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, and I, with skills that complemented each other, working very closely together. I think we used baling wire and duct tape for a while. And then it's a story of, I think, Congress acting, because we can be critical of Congress, but in both with Fannie and Freddie, where we got unlimited, which was really unspecified. We said unspecified. When we went there and I asked for unlimited authority, I knew unlimited didn't sound great, so we said unspecified. But we got unspecified authority there, and then we got the TARP, and right in the middle of a national election. At the end of the day, we had both presidential candidates supported the TARP, and the leaders in both the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle, the leadership supported it. And so to come together and get that done, I think was critical. And then I think I gotta admit, there was a certain amount of luck because there was a buyer for Merrill Lynch. There was, And if without a buyer, without the TARP, that would not have been because we learned with Bear Stearns, we learned with an investment bank, we didn't have resolution authorities to let them fail. They'd go through the bankruptcy process, and it could create havoc in the financial system and the economy. But we learned we didn't have those authorities, but we were very fortunate that we had a buyer, J.P. Morgan, where they could make a quick decision, credibility, CEO who had the confidence of the board, and then J.P. Morgan guaranteed the trading book, which we had no authority in the U.S. government to do it. The Fed didn't have the authority to do that during a shareholder vote. So we then immediately started focusing on Lehman Brothers and say, what are we going to do? And regrettably, we came close to figuring out how to rescue Lehman, but at the end, we didn't have a buyer and we didn't have the authorities. But fortunately, there were the authorities that the Fed had, which worked to save AIG, and B of A bought Merrill Lynch.
I'm going to go to the floor, but before we go to the microphones, I wanted to ask, this is almost like, not quite a cold call, but a cold opportunity. Two professors here, Professor Zeckhauser and Professor Porter on the front row, if they have a question or a comment, and that might elicit a comment. Richard, do you have a thought? Because I'm always curious how you are processing things.
David's question is to whether we were lucky or how close we came and so forth. Do you think of all this in terms of probabilities, and that maybe we went to bed some night thinking that 5% chance to wake up the next morning and it really would be in a crisis?
It's an interesting thing. I don't know how to describe this. I said to a friend, if you're boiling in oil, it doesn't make much difference if it's 150 degrees, 180 degrees, or 200 degrees. You're boiling in oil. And when I went to bed, there's no doubt I was worried, okay? And I didn't, people would ask me, did you try to understand exactly how bad it would be if the system collapsed or how you would ever put it back together again? And I didn't, because it was so unacceptable to think about that. We were so busy that during the day, I found that when I was the things were coming at me and you were on the phone all the time or in meetings, I didn't have time, with 3 or 4 exceptions, to get really scared, okay? But at night, after I'd go to sleep immediately, my head would hit the pillow, and when we talked about sleepless nights, Wendy would laugh because she'd say I'd be snoring at 5 minutes after my head hit the pillow. But what happened during the crisis was when I woke up at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, I often didn't go back to sleep. And because then I thought about, and I didn't put a probability on it. I didn't put a probability. It was just an all-out race from mid-August, when we began to get the information. After getting the powers from Congress, we got teams in to look at Fannie and Freddie's books. And we got in to look at their books. I could see what was going to happen. And they had to be stabilized before the banks announced their earnings. I could saw Lehman Brothers earnings. But from mid-August right through October 14th, when we guaranteed bank liabilities and put the capital in the banks, it was just an all-out race to stave off disaster. And then even after we did that, I worried. I had looked like Citigroup was going to go down despite everything and take down the system with it. So we had we had a scare there. And then right up the very end, as I've written and talked about, I had a huge concern about the Merrill Lynch losses and destabilizing Merrill Lynch and B of A. And the concern that we didn't have the last $350 billion of the TARP. And so if there was a chain reaction, we wouldn't be able to deal with that. So it was, but never a probability. It was always, I just said it's unacceptable. We just can't let it collapse. But I think we were close.
The way you describe it, it's sort of like
one of these arcade games when you're driving a car and a new
Yeah.
obstacle comes at you and something else comes at you and so on and so forth. And there are people who are terrific at dealing with that, as we've seen recently
Yeah.
in the Olympics. I'm just wondering, might you have done better if you had stopped for a day and sort of said, what's a week or 2 weeks down the road? I mean, I understand you have no time in a crisis.
Well, no, we had from July of 2007 until Bear Stearns went down, we were doing everything we could think of, and been working to get the powers with Fannie and Freddie. After Bear Stearns was rescued, we came out with what we needed from a regulatory standpoint. I made speeches about needing resolution authority, the fact that we had no power to guarantee capital, liabilities, or put capital in. So to me, and I'm not saying this to justify, it's just a fact, that even in the midst of the crisis, the House voted no the first time to the TARP. So you read the story, you'll read of everything we did with regard to try to see around the corners, to get the Fed involved along with the SEC in regulating the investment banks, but to try to fix a regulatory system or to give us powers that Congress still, right now we have a very articulate, very popular president who has made the case, and a year and a half after whatever the crisis, we still don't have the regulatory powers and the authorities. So what I look at it is to say, and I'm not trying to be defensive about it, that we held it together, and it was tactical, one step after another, but it worked. And I can think of plenty of things I wish I'd done differently, but I believe every one of the major decisions we made was a right one. And the ones that are normally considered to be mistakes were ones where we didn't have the power we couldn't find a way to prevent the Lehman Brothers failure. And so I look at it and say, what we did was right, and we did it with imperfect tools in the middle of a very difficult, couldn't have been a worse time politically with a major election coming up. And so and we couldn't get ahead of it. And the first time when we got the authorities, then I think we did something that was very strategic. You know, what other country could put capital in on a weekend in 9 banks with 50% of the deposits and design a program that at least I think 3,000 banks would have participated in, and it would have been a good thing for the country if it hadn't been stigmatized ultimately by politicians, and guaranteeing the liabilities of the banks. So again, we knew we wanted Congress to act, and we had break the glass plans to go to Congress and act for authorities. But we couldn't think of anything worse than going up and saying, give us the authorities, and not getting them. And we were told we couldn't get them unless there was a clear need and an emergency. So if we went forward and said, guess what? If you don't give us these authorities, Lehman is going to fail and we're going to have no way to control the damage, they would have failed the next day.
One of the fascinating features of the timing of this particular instance is that it occurred late in the second term of a president who was not in a position to run. And so you had two candidates seeking to succeed him. And one of the issues that you had to think about very long and hard is, how much do I tell whom and when? Because in a very real sense, in our American political system, we have a single elected figure at the head of the executive branch. The Treasury Secretary serves at the pleasure of the president. So you had to think about, how much are you going to tell? How much detail does he need? What kinds of things does he need to know? What authorization do I need to get from the sitting president? But then you had this very curious situation of both of our major political parties having selected who their candidates were going to be, and you wanted to keep them informed, but you had to be very careful about what you said to, I assume you had to be very careful about what you said to whom, because any statements that they might make could in fact make your life much more difficult. So I think it would be fascinating to hear how you thought about who to tell what when.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I want to start with George Bush and say that I was, and I know that those that have a caricature of George Bush sometimes don't like to hear me say it, but my life was infinitely easier because this was a president who understood markets, was no fan of Wall Street or Fannie or Freddie, and knew how unpalatable these things would be, but always understood the issues and supported me and said, forget about the polls, forget about this may look ugly, it may be unpopular, but this is about our economy, our jobs, and I'm going to support you. And so rather than making it difficult for me, he was bucking me up. And then in terms of communicating, he encouraged me to do what was my natural inclination. I gave great information, constant information to both presidential candidates. And when you stop and think about it, here's why. The American people did not like bailouts or anything that smacked of a bailout. I tell the story, and I don't remember, I wish I could remember when the poll came out. It might have been after I'd left or whatever, but there was 93% of the American people were against the bailouts and 60% were against torture, so. And Barack Obama, at his State of the Union, he said one thing that unites Republicans and Democrats, they all hate the bailouts, okay? So it would have been very easy for either candidate to play the populist card, and particularly John McCain when he was falling behind, and come out against the TARP. I talked with them frequently, and when we needed to switch to capital because the situation had changed, the problem was much worse than even those of us who were most pessimistic had understood, and given what was happening all over Europe, we needed to do something really dramatic. I didn't sleep at night. I didn't really go to sleep until after the last conversation I'd had on the 14th of October was with John McCain when he was very unhappy, and I explained to him why we'd done what we'd done, but knew that if he'd come out against it, it would have stigmatized the program and the banks wouldn't have taken it. So but there were situations where I couldn't talk in advance, and a good example was Fannie and Freddie. And the first chapter of the book begins when I'm in the president's office, and he's saying to me, Hank, we have this situation where the authorities we got from Congress didn't let us put capital in Fannie or Freddie unless they agreed to the terms. And yet we needed to move to stabilize them and to put the United States of America behind this, and that would be putting them into conservatorship. And so I couldn't talk about that, and I couldn't talk about it to members of Congress. And the president said to me, boy, they're going to find out, and they're going to run right up to the Hill, and how are you going to do this? And I'd said to him, I said, well, the first sound they're going to hear, Mr. President, is when their heads hit the floor. So that was an example of moving quickly. But then right after that, literally, I called all the leaders, let them know that this wasn't politically driven, this was a timeout, and why we'd done it. And I called both, well, I was going to call both presidential candidates after it was announced, but we'd met first, we thought, in privacy with the boards, with the management teams, and we were going to meet with the boards and then make the calls. But I got a call from Barack Obama on Friday night. Okay, so he called me at home and tracked me down. He was so tuned in to what was happening and the economic issues, so I was on the phone with him for a good while. And so then the next day I had the conversation with John McCain and Sarah Palin and explained it. But usually I needed to continually talk all through the campaign, because if we didn't have each presidential candidate, they either had to be supportive of what we're doing or not publicly criticize us. Because if they really publicly criticize us, the program wouldn't have worked.
That close. Interesting. Well, let's go to the floor. John Sweeney, do you have a question? Do you want to come to the microphone back here with an initial question? We'd love to hear from you. John Sweeney, as all of you know, is here after running the AFL-CIO and actually has an interesting relationship with Secretary Paulson.
Thank you very much, David. I don't really have a question. The Secretary knows our position on various parts of all of this, and we have had the opportunity to express our position over the several months. But we've had a good relationship with the Secretary, and I just want to thank him for the great contribution that he made to our country and how he proceeded in saving our economy. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, John.
We'll start here. We have 4 microphones already lined up, and you know it's the rules of the game. 1 question per customer, ends in a question mark, and is brief. You might identify yourself first.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sebastian Litter. I'm here from the Harvard Kennedy School. I want to go back to the fundamental reasons of the crisis. So my question is, what do you think, what is the role of greed in that crisis? And I'm not talking only about greed of bankers wanting to make more profits, but also greed of ordinary people wanting to have more of everything, wanting to buy bigger TVs that they can't afford, bigger cars they can't afford, bigger houses they can't afford. Is this something that will change in the future, or will it all come back to these levels and maybe lead to another crisis?
Well, clearly in my book, the first draft, I used the word greed, and then I used the word profit motive, because I think that you need to assume that business people and investors are driven to maximize profits. So you need to understand that. And market-driven systems recognize this fact, and they're imperfect, but they're the best systems in the world, and they've taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So the key thing is to recognize this, and then design regulatory systems and some of the things I've talked about to deal with that. And number 1. Number 2, I need to, as someone who believes in, cares deeply about environmental issues and conservation, I do believe that one thing it's going to become increasingly apparent, others around the world can't live the way we've lived, and we can't continue to live the way we've lived. And we're going to need to make some adjustments. And that one of the things I've written is if one of the lessons of the credit crisis is that we as a nation need to save more and consume less, that's a good lesson. And public policymakers need to deal with some of these issues. So again, a lot of things came together, but don't expect self-interest and a profit motive to go away, and it needs to be harnessed, channeled, and we need to have regulations and a regulatory system be designed to recognize this fact.
Secretary Paulson, thank you so much for coming. My name is Pratik Kumar, and I'm a junior here at the college. Given your experiences, first as the head of Goldman Sachs and then as Secretary of the Treasury, I was wondering if you could briefly comment on President Obama's proposal to ban proprietary trading at the investment banks.
Right. What I wrote a editorial in the New York Times sometime in the last couple weeks that dealt with my views. And by and large, I'm positive about President Obama's proposals. On that particular one, I'm not supportive. I believe if you look at the credit crisis, that it would have made no difference with regard to the Lehman failure, the AIG, Fannie, Freddie, Wachovia, Washington Mutual, that trading, and it's very hard to differentiate the different kinds of trading, but trading is one business activity that can get firms in trouble. There's a whole series of other business activities that can get them in trouble. And so I want a proposal that's going to stand the test of time. And so to me, the way to do that is to have a systemic risk regulator, as I said, that can look at any type of institution, not just banks with depository insurance, but look at any type of institution and intervene for any type of business activity that is got the potential to take the financial system and our economy down. And then I believe also very strongly that we need tough capital requirements, tough requirements on liquidity, so that is my approach. And then the ultimate way of dealing with these big financial institutions is no institution can be too big to fail. And the only way you can get there is the expectation that if they do fail, we have the regulators properly trained to liquidate them so we know that the taxpayer is not going to be asked to come in again and save them in their present form. And this may require the institutions working with a regulator to really develop a roadmap for the way they'd be liquidated if they fail. So I agree that the issue of size is something that needs to be dealt with, and I want strong regulation. I just don't favor that particular way of getting at it.
Yes.
My name is Emmanuel Hooper. I research on institutional corruption both in Washington and Wall Street. And I read a lot of the accounts of what happened, and I'm very curious as to this challenge as to basically the corruption in Washington and also in Wall Street. That is, how do you get the regulators to, basically how do you get Congress to pass a law to separate the risks of the average person from the high-risk taking investors, such as credit for swaps, et cetera, because you've got tremendous lobbies from Wall Street going to Washington, so that if the Obama administration is very serious, really to legislate to the point what you just said in the last comment, how is he going to be willing to separate himself from the influence of lobbies and get something that will work for the country long term?
Well, we clearly need, as you said, the regulatory reform. I am maybe too optimistic on this issue, but I'm more optimistic than you are in the sense that I believe that the proposals I've looked at, for instance, credit default swaps, would require that all of the standardized swaps, which is the vast majority of them, would be traded on an exchange, and the others on a central clearinghouse where there'd be significant capital requirements behind them. And so I think that's a good proposal, and I'm optimistic it'll get done. I'm also, although I'm discouraged it's taken so long, I'm optimistic that some of the reforms, that the right reforms are being worked on. So this needs to get done. But I do think the question, and there's just a lot of reasons why it's difficult to get Congress to act, and part of the reason is that these are very complicated issues, and well-meaning, well-intentioned people are on both sides of the issues up on the Hill. So that is one of the challenges of our system, but I'm optimistic that we will come out with reform, and if we don't, the next crisis has got the potential to be worse.
Good evening, Secretary Paulson. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Alex. I'm a freshman at the college. And during the Great Depression, which is what we often compare this crisis to, we saw a flurry of bipartisan financial reforms, Glass-Steagall, the FDIC. I was curious as to why in the United States the work of reform has so much more broader scope then than it does now. I mean, we are only a couple years into the crisis. And also, as a full disclosure, this is an essay topic for one of my classes, so.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. Just remember that, and I've read a couple books on the crisis leading up to the Great Depression, including Lords of Finance, which is a very good book in terms of what they were dealing with. And just remember that went on for a good while. And a lot of the early things that were done were policy mistakes. And so the reform was a good while in coming. And so here, of course, the system didn't collapse. And so as your congressman here explained to me, when and Barney Frank, I thought, had a good understanding of both the politics and the financial markets. And he explained to me that you don't get a lot of credit for preventing a disaster that people never see. So remember, we haven't had the Great Depression. And I'm hopeful we'll get this wholesale reform because, it's broad-based reform. Because what's happened after, you had the reform after the Depression, and then you've had a patchwork quilt of regulators, and we just haven't had the kind of reform we need. And I think we will, I'm optimistic we'll get it. And I guess the simple answer is, I think it's, even though it seems like a long time to me and to you, that Congress hasn't acted. These are very complicated, difficult issues, and they're working hard to get it right. And it's still, and look at history, it's still a relatively short period of time.
Noelia Rodriguez, the real power around here, has signaled we have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Reed Capolino. I'm at the Kennedy School. Secretary Paulson, recognizing that it may have yielded a profit this time, the next time a systemically important bank needs to be recapitalized, should the government policy again be to buy common shares in the bank, or should any public support be made contingent on taxpayers being put higher up in the capital structure, perhaps via even loans that would be made senior to the bank's own debt?
Well, let me say what just so you know what we did, okay, with the banks, because I'm proud of this. We developed what we put in because I didn't want it to look like nationalization or be nationalization. We designed a program that would take a sort of a systemic view, and rather than dealing one-off with failing institutions, one that would be attractive to a lot of institutions and where the government will get their money back. So we put in preferred stock, which that meant it was non-voting unless there was a problem, and it was ahead of common stock in terms of getting paid back. So that was the way it was designed, and I believe that was the right policy. Now to get to your question, I would like to see a situation, I'd like to see resolution authorities so that when a bank fails, that there was a very high bar to get over in terms of, you know, the executive branch, the Treasury Secretary, 2/3 of the vote of the Fed, the FDIC, but then there are very broad powers to do what needs to be done, but the idea is to liquidate, okay? Not to do what we did, to liquidate. And to liquidate them so the taxpayer isn't coming in again. And that's why people are so angry in this country. They're angry because, so that's what way I'd like to see it. And so the idea of debating whether they put in equity or put in preferred, I know why we put in preferred. We put in preferred and it worked. You know, it stabilized the system and it's going to come back with a profit. Okay? Yeah.
Last question.
Secretary Paulson, thank you again for addressing us. I'm Anirudh Surya, student at the Kennedy School. Way before, well, not way before, but before the crisis hit and ended up defining your tenure, I think, as Secretary of Treasury, you had started a strategic economic dialogue with China.
Right.
Could you talk a bit more about that process and the lessons that you learned from your time leading that dialogue with China, and what lessons you'd drawn that current Secretary of Treasury could learn from, both in terms of the US-China economic relationship as well as the structural changes may be needed within the US economy?
Well, I would say a couple of things there. First of all, I think we need to recognize that that if the US economy does well, it benefits China. And if China, this is general proposition, does well, that benefits us. That doesn't mean we have the same interests. But the worst thing, for all those that say, gee, we look weak relative to China, the worst thing that could have happened to us was at the time that the US and Europe were having their problems. If the Chinese economy had gone into the tank, we would have a really serious problem here. So that's number one. A second thing, the strategic economic dialogue which we set up with China was based upon the view that China was the biggest developing economy in the world. We were the biggest developed economy, and there was very difficult, it was going to be very hard to solve any global economic issues if the two of us don't come together, and it's going to be easier if the two of us do come together. And so this was based upon sort of no surprises, being very candid, very direct, very aggressive behind closed doors, and looking for areas where we could come together and get agreement. We talked about a wide range of issues, and so when we dealt with some very tough product safety, food safety issues, China was very constructive during the economic crisis. It was a humbling experience for me, because we talked with them candidly. And the biggest lesson I learned is how important engagement is, and I already knew that, and how important it is not to surprise each other. That there's no need to surprise each other, and the more we talk through the issues, the greater opportunity we'll have to come to areas where we agree. And there'll be certain areas where we, and where we don't always agree. And as I talked with the Chinese, one of the things I learned is that although they were committed to economic reform, they were, I wanted them to move quicker. We would talk, we would agree, and I would think they should move this far, and they would think they should move this far, and I would want to do it in this period of time, and they'd want to do it in that period of time. But we got, if you take a look at how the currency moved during the strategic economic dialogue, I think you'd see the record compared to what's going on before and after was pretty good. And I think the way we dealt with some of the issues we dealt with was good. I pushed very hard to have them open up their economy quicker to competition. And I explained I believed that opening up our economy benefited us and them, but they sure would make it a lot easier for me to fight to keep our economy open if they would move quicker to open up theirs. But I think the biggest lesson is the importance of engagement and understanding the other sovereign nation's objective. So we're not lecturing them or talking about everything from our perspective. We have to understand their perspective, because if it doesn't make sense for them, it's going to be hard to get them to move. Thank you.
I want to thank you particularly for that last question, because it underscores or brought out that, and he's being too modest about it, the Secretary, while he was at Goldman Sachs, made some 70 trips to China and became the founding chair of the School of Economics and Management at Tsinghua University. And also, I'm sure very much in partnership with Wendy, worked with the Chinese government in the Yunnan province to set up a national park and conservation area. So he's taken a very strong personal interest in this and our relationship with China, and I think will probably continue in that role. Mr. Secretary, as we close this evening, I must tell you, one of the most memorable evenings I spent in this forum was when Bob McNamara and Ted Sorensen came here, I think with Graham Allison, to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was fascinating to hear about leadership during a crisis. And this has been an equally memorable night. We thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.